If that alarm goes off again, don't touch anything, Laura Whitman said, her voice sharp enough to stop the room. We are not delaying this inspection over a glitch. The red light above the panel was still blinking when she turned away, already moving on, already done with it. A few feet back, Ethan Brooks stood with one hand on a mop handle, eyes fixed on the electrical board. He did not speak. He did not need to. He watched the numbers settle, then spike again, just a flicker, less than a second. No one else noticed. Someone laughed behind him. Hey, janitor. You planning to fix that too? Ethan lowered his gaze, nodded once as if he had not heard the tone, and reached into his pocket. He pulled out a small, worn notebook and wrote down a number. Time. Load. Sequence. The room moved on without him. It always did. Ethan worked nights. 12-hour shifts. 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. He cleaned offices, emptied trash, and wiped down surfaces no one thought about twice. But every night he also watched the building. Not like security. Not like management. He watched patterns. The hum of the systems. The heat that lingered too long. The slight delay between one machine shutting down and another picking up the load. It was not in any manual. It was not his job. But he kept track anyway. That night something did not line up. At 2:14 a.m., the load on the south panel climbed higher than it should have. Not enough to trigger an alert. Not enough for the system to flag it. But enough. Ethan noticed because it had happened before. Not once. Not twice. Pattern. Small. Quiet. Easy to ignore if you trusted the system more than your own eyes. The next morning he tried to say something. There's a fluctuation on. We've got it covered. Laura cut in. Not even looking at him. Just focus on your tasks. The engineer beside her did not bother hiding his smile. Appreciate the concern, though. A few people chuckled. Ethan nodded again, the same way he always did, and turned away before they could say more. But that night the numbers came back. Higher this time. The panel ran hotter. He could feel it through the metal casing. A faint warmth that did not belong at that hour. He checked the logs he had. Access to. Limited. Surface level. Not enough to prove anything, but enough to confirm a trend. He walked to the restricted door. Keypad access. He entered his code. Denied. Again. Access restricted. Of course it was. He stood there for a second longer than necessary, then stepped back. No frustration. No argument. Just thought. Behind that door was the line carrying more load than it should. A line no one was watching because the system said everything was fine. Ethan looked down at his notebook. The last 3 entries lined up perfectly. Same time. Same spike. Same slow drop. He closed the notebook, slid it back into his pocket, and turned toward the panel again. Quiet. Controlled. Precise. He did not need permission to see what was already happening. At 2:16 a.m., the number climbed again. Not fast. Not dramatic. Just steady enough to disappear if you blinked. Ethan did not blink. He stood in front of the panel, eyes tracking the load as it moved past what it had done the night before. The system stayed quiet. No alarms. No warnings. Just a green status light pretending everything was normal. Ethan reached out and placed his hand against the metal. Warmer now. Not hot enough to trigger a shutdown. Not yet. But wrong. He checked the time. Same window. Same pattern. The building was asleep, but the load was not dropping the way it should. Somewhere, something was pulling more than it was designed to carry. He stepped back and looked at the distribution lines on the diagram mounted beside the panel. South wing. Conference level. Temporary equipment added for the inspection. That made sense. What did not make sense was how the load was being balanced. Or rather, how it was not. Ethan moved quickly now, but without noise. He grabbed his cart and pushed it down the hallway, wheels barely making a sound on the polished floor. Cameras would see a janitor doing his rounds. That was fine. That was what they expected. He stopped at the restricted door again. Keypad. Denied. Same as before. He did not try a third time. Instead, he turned to the auxiliary panel mounted just outside the room. Limited control. Not enough for full access, but enough to see more than the main display showed. He opened it. Inside, the readings told a different story. One line was carrying more load than the others by a margin that should not exist. Not under normal conditions. Not under any approved configuration. Ethan flipped through his notebook. The last 3 nights lined up perfectly. Same line. Same time. Increasing each night. He did the math in his head. If the pattern held, the load would cross a critical threshold within hours. Still no alarm. The system would not react until it was too late. He glanced down the empty hallway. No one was coming. No one would check until morning. And by then, the report would say everything had been stable. Ethan closed the panel slowly. He stood there for a moment, not hesitating, just confirming. Then he made a decision. No call. No report. He had already tried that. He reached for the manual override latch. It was not locked. It was simply not meant for someone like him to use. He knew what it would do. Shift part of the load to a secondary line. Temporary. Controlled. Enough to buy time. If he was wrong, it would show immediately. If he was right, nothing would happen. That was the point. No noise. No incident. Just prevention. Ethan adjusted the setting by a fraction. Not a full switch. Just enough to redistribute the pressure. The numbers responded slowly. Then they leveled. Not perfect, but safe. He watched for 10 seconds. 20. 30. Stable. He released the latch and stepped back. The panel returned to its quiet state. Green light. No alarm. Same as before. Anyone walking by would have thought nothing had changed. Ethan picked up his cart and moved on. Same pace. Same routine. Down the hall, around the corner, into the next room. By morning, the logs would tell a story. Not the one people expected, but one they would not be able to ignore. At 6:42 a.m., the building was full again. Lights on. Elevators running. Voices in the hallway. The inspection team arrived 10 minutes early. Laura Whitman walked them through the lobby with a steady pace and a confident tone. All systems have been stable, she said, without slowing down and without checking anything behind her. Ethan was already finishing his shift. He stood near the service corridor, wiping down a stainless steel surface that did not need wiping. From where he stood, he could see the edge of the main panel room. The same door he had been denied hours before was now open. Engineers moved in and out, carrying tablets, checking readings, nodding to one another. No alarms. No visible issues. Exactly what Laura wanted. One of the inspectors paused near the panel. Can we pull last night's load data? Laura smiled. Of course. She gestured to one of the engineers. Show them. Ethan did not move. He kept working, slow and quiet, but his eyes shifted just enough to follow the conversation. The engineer pulled up the logs. Clean. Smooth curves. No spikes. No alerts. For a second, it looked like nothing had happened. Then the inspector leaned in. Hold on, he said. Zoom in here. The room got quieter. A small dip in the load graph appeared. Not large. Not dramatic. But precise. Too precise to be random. What caused that? The inspector asked. The engineer frowned. System adjustment, maybe? Laura stepped in immediately. Our system auto-balances minor fluctuations. It is designed to prevent overload. Her answer came fast. Confident. Final. The inspector did not respond right away. He tapped the screen again. This is not automatic, he said. This is manual. The room shifted. Subtle but real. The engineer scrolled deeper into the log details. Timestamp. Input source. Override signal. Then it appeared. A line of text no one had mentioned. Manual redistribution initiated. User ID attached. The engineer stopped scrolling. Laura's expression held, but only barely. Who authorized that? The inspector asked. No one answered. Ethan turned away and pushed his cart down the hallway as if the moment had nothing to do with him. Behind him, the engineer read the ID out loud. Not a manager. Not a technician. A maintenance access code. The kind assigned to night staff. The kind no one expected to matter. The inspector looked up. Who was on shift? Silence. Then footsteps. Someone moved toward the corridor. Ethan did not speed up, did not slow down. He kept the same pace he always had. Behind him, the system logs remained on the screen. Quiet, precise, impossible to ignore. And for the first time, the room was no longer certain it understood what had happened during the night. They found Ethan before he reached the end of the corridor. "Ethan Brooks?" A voice called, not loud, but sharp enough to stop him. He turned, one hand still resting on the cart handle, expression neutral, as if he had expected this moment but had no intention of claiming it. The inspector stepped closer, tablet in hand. "Were you in the electrical access area around 2:16 this morning?" Ethan did not answer immediately. He looked past the inspector for just a second, toward the open panel room where the screen still showed the log. Then he nodded once. "Yes." Laura moved in quickly. "He does not have authorization to make system changes," she said, her voice controlled, but tighter than before. If anything was done, it was outside protocol. Ethan did not react. He did not defend himself. He did not explain. The inspector glanced at the screen, then back at Ethan. "What exactly did you do?" Ethan chose his words carefully. "I shifted part of the load from the south line to the secondary line. No extra detail, no emphasis, just the action." One of the engineers frowned. "That isn't necessary unless there is a load imbalance." Ethan nodded again. There was. Pause followed. Not long, but long enough to change the air in the hallway. The inspector turned back to the engineer. "Can we simulate the original load without the manual adjustment?" The engineer hesitated. "We can approximate it." "Do it." They moved back into the panel room. Ethan stayed where he was. He did not follow. He did not need to. The system would speak now. Within minutes, the numbers on the screen began to climb again. Not in real time, but reconstructed. Same pattern. Same increase. Then higher. The engineer's voice dropped. If this had continued, he did not finish. He did not need to. Another engineer stepped closer. The line would have exceeded safe operating limits within 2 hours. The inspector nodded slowly. "And the system did not flag it?" "No," the engineer admitted. "It stayed under the alert threshold." Laura crossed her arms, but said nothing. The explanation she had given earlier no longer held. Not against this. Not against the sequence now visible to everyone in the room. The inspector turned back toward the hallway. "Bring him in." Ethan stepped forward when they called him. Same pace. Same calm. No urgency. No hesitation. He stopped just inside the doorway, not fully crossing into the center of the room. The inspector held up the tablet. "You saw this before it reached the threshold?" Ethan nodded. It had been building for 3 nights. The engineer looked up sharply. 3. Ethan reached into his pocket and pulled out the small notebook. He opened it to the last page. Dates, times, numbers. Clean, consistent, undeniable. He handed it over without a word. The inspector scanned the entries, then passed it to the engineer. No one laughed now. No one interrupted. The room adjusted around a truth that had been there the whole time, just not where they had been looking. No one spoke for a few seconds after the notebook changed hands. The engineer flipped through the pages again, slower this time, as if expecting the numbers to change. They did not. Same timestamps, same pattern. 3 nights in a row. The inspector looked at Ethan, then at the panel, then back at the screen. "Why was this not reported?" he asked, not to Ethan but to the room. Laura answered first. "Because there was no alert. The system did not flag a critical issue. It sounded reasonable. It always had. Until now." The inspector did not challenge her directly. He simply turned the tablet so everyone could see the projection. "The system did not flag it," he said, calm and precise. "But the condition existed. That was the difference. One the room could not ignore anymore." The engineer nodded slowly. "The load stayed just under the threshold. It would not trigger an automatic response." He paused. but it was not stable. Ethan stood near the doorway, hands relaxed at his sides, saying nothing. He did not need to repeat what was already written. The inspector stepped closer to the panel. And if the manual redistribution had not happened? This time, the engineer did not hesitate. The line would have exceeded safe limits before 4:15 a.m. Another silence followed. He continued more carefully now. At that point, we would have had to shut down the entire south wing to prevent escalation. Not dramatic, not loud, but costly, disruptive, avoidable. Laura's posture shifted just slightly. Not a collapse, not an admission, just less certainty than before. We rely on system thresholds for a reason, she said. Manual intervention without authorization introduces risk. The inspector nodded once. And ignoring a pattern introduces a different kind of risk. He let that sit. Then he looked at Ethan again. You recognized the pattern without full system access? Ethan nodded. Yes. How? Timing. Load behavior. Heat. No long explanation. No attempt to impress. Just the factors that mattered. The engineer glanced at the panel, then back at Ethan. You checked the temperature? Ethan shook his head. Not with a sensor. A brief pause. By hand. That landed differently. Not technical. Not complex. But precise in its own way. The inspector exhaled slowly, then turned to Laura. Effective immediately, manual observation procedures need to be reinstated alongside automated monitoring. It was not a suggestion. It was a correction. Laura did not argue. She nodded once. Professional. Controlled. But the hierarchy in the room had already shifted. The system had not failed completely, but it had missed something one person did not. And that mattered now. The engineer handed the notebook back to Ethan. Not casually, carefully, like it was part of the record now. Ethan took it, closed it, and slid it back into his pocket. No reaction. No acknowledgement beyond that. The inspector made one final note on his tablet. We will include this in the report. Manual intervention prevented a threshold breach the system did not detect. He looked at Ethan one last time. Not with surprise. Not with doubt. Just recognition. Then he turned away. The room began to move again. Conversations resumed. Adjustments were made. But the tone had changed. Not louder. Not softer. Just more careful. Ethan stepped back into the hallway, picked up his cart, and continued down the corridor. Same pace. Same routine. But behind him, the system was no longer trusted the same way. And neither was the assumption about who in the building actually understood it. By the next evening, the building was quieter than usual, but not for the same reasons. Notices had been sent. Procedures updated. Access logs reviewed. Nothing dramatic. Just small corrections placed exactly where they mattered. Ethan clocked in at 7 p.m., like always. Same uniform. Same cart. Same route. No announcement waited for him. No meeting. No recognition speech. That was not how this place worked. But something had changed. When he passed the main panel room, the door was open again. Not for inspection this time. For adjustment. 2 engineers stood inside, reviewing new parameters. One of them looked up as Ethan walked by. A brief pause. Then a nod. Not exaggerated. Not performative. Just acknowledgement. Ethan returned it the same way and kept moving. Inside the room, a new line had been added to the operating procedure. Displayed on the wall. Manual observation required during off-peak hours. It was written in the same font as everything else, but it carried a different weight now. Not a suggestion. A correction built from something that had already happened. Laura stood near the back of the room, reviewing a checklist. Her posture was the same. Controlled. Professional. But she was reading slower. Checking more than once. When one of the engineers mentioned the overnight load pattern, she did not interrupt. She listened. That was new. Ethan moved down the corridor, stopping where he always did first. Trash bins. Surfaces. Corners most people never saw. He worked with the same rhythm, the same quiet precision. As he passed the auxiliary panel again, he slowed just slightly. Not to interfere. Not to adjust. Just to look. The numbers held steady. Balanced. No hidden climb. No quiet drift toward a threshold. He placed his hand lightly against the metal casing. Cool. Exactly where it should be. He removed his hand and continued. Around 9 p.m., a junior technician approached him near the supply closet. "Hey," the technician said, unsure how to begin. "Last night. That adjustment. How did you know?" Ethan did not stop working. He tied off a trash bag, set it aside, then answered. "It repeated." The technician frowned. "The system didn't show it." Ethan nodded. "Not at that level." A short pause followed. The technician looked like he wanted more detail, more explanation. But Ethan did not add anything else. He did not turn it into a lesson. He just moved on to the next task. That was enough. Later, near midnight, the building settled into its usual rhythm. Fewer lights, lower noise, systems running in the background. Ethan passed the panel one more time. The display was quiet, stable, predictable. He reached into his pocket, pulled out the notebook, and flipped to a new page. He wrote down the time, the load, the absence of fluctuation. Then he paused for a second, pen still in hand. Not because something was wrong, because nothing was. He closed the notebook, slipped it back into his pocket, and adjusted his grip on the cart. The hallway stretched ahead, clean and empty. Behind him, the system ran the way it was supposed to. And now, there was a line in the process that made sure someone like him would always be watching. The next week, the building did not feel different to most people. Meetings started on time. Systems reported green. Reports were filed and closed. But underneath that surface, the way decisions were made had shifted. Not loudly, not officially announced. Just enough to change who got listened to. At 2:10 a.m., Ethan stood in front of the panel again. Same position, same distance. His reflection faint in the glass. The numbers were steady. Then, for a brief moment, one line flickered. Not a spike, not a rise, just a hesitation in the drop. Ethan saw it. No one else was there to miss it. He did not move right away. He watched, waited for a second pattern. It did not repeat. He reached into his pocket, opened the notebook, and wrote it down anyway. Time. Behavior. No conclusion. Just record. Footsteps approached behind him. The junior technician from earlier stopped a few feet away. "You see something?" he asked, without the uncertainty from before. Ethan kept his eyes on the panel. "Not yet." The technician nodded, accepting that answer without pushing further. They stood there for a few seconds in silence. Not awkward, just shared attention. The technician glanced at the panel, then back at Ethan. "They added your note to the procedure," he said quietly. Ethan did not respond. He already knew. He had seen it on the wall. The technician continued. "Manual observation during low-load cycles. That wasn't there last month." Ethan closed the notebook. "It is now. Simple. Final." The technician let out a small breath. "I checked the old reports. That pattern you found. It was there before. Just smaller. No one flagged it." Ethan looked at the panel again. "It doesn't start big." The technician followed his gaze. "So what do we do if it shows up again?" Ethan adjusted his grip on the cart handle. "You watch it." The answer was not technical. It was not detailed. But it was correct. The technician nodded slowly, as if understanding something that had never been written in any manual. They stood there a moment longer. The panel stayed stable. No second flicker. No escalation. Ethan turned away first. He had other work to finish. Floors to clean. Bins to empty. The routine did not change just because people were paying attention now. As he moved down the hallway, the technician stayed behind, eyes still on the panel. Not because he was told to, because now he knew what to look for. By morning, nothing had happened. No incident. No report. Just another quiet night where the system held. But the difference was not in the outcome. It was in the awareness. The building no longer relied on thresholds alone. It relied on someone noticing before the numbers made it obvious. 2 nights later, the pattern came back. Not the same shape, not the same timing, but close enough that Ethan stopped before he reached the panel. The building was quieter than usual. Fewer late meetings. Lower baseline load, which made the shift easier to see. A slight rise on a line that should have been dropping. Subtle, almost polite, the kind of change the system would accept without question. Ethan stepped closer. He did not touch the panel this time. He watched, counted the seconds in his head. 1, 2, 3. The line did not correct itself. Behind him, the junior technician was already there. He had started coming by during this window without being told. "I see it," the technician said quietly, eyes fixed on the display. Ethan nodded once. No explanation, no instruction. The technician moved to the auxiliary panel and opened it. His hands were steady, but slower than Ethan's had been that first night. He checked the distribution, confirmed the imbalance, then looked back. Same line family, not a question. Ethan stepped in just enough to see the numbers. Earlier, the technician understood. The pattern was accelerating now. Not over days, over hours. He hesitated for 1 second, not from fear, from responsibility. Then he reached for the manual control. "Do it before it builds," Ethan said. The technician adjusted the load in small increments, watching the response after each change. No sudden moves. No overcorrection. The line settled. The system stayed quiet. No alarm. No disruption. Just a problem that never had the chance to become visible. The technician exhaled slowly. It wouldn't have flagged again. Ethan closed the auxiliary panel. Not in time. They stood there for a moment, both looking at the now stable display. This time there was no doubt. No debate. The action had been correct. The timing had been right, and it had not come from the system. Footsteps approached from the far end of the corridor. Laura Whitman. She stopped when she saw them at the panel. Her eyes moved from the display to the auxiliary panel, then back to the technician. "What happened?" The technician answered before Ethan could. "Load imbalance. We corrected it." Laura stepped closer, scanning the numbers. Everything looked normal, stable. "Did the system alert?" "No," the technician said. Laura paused, then looked at Ethan. Not dismissive this time, not interrupting, just looking. Ethan met her gaze briefly, then looked back at the panel. No explanation offered. None needed. Laura nodded once, more to herself than to them. "Log it." The technician already had. Time, action, reason, clear, traceable, aligned with the new procedure. Laura stayed for a few seconds longer, watching the display as if expecting it to reveal something more. It did not. That was the point. She turned and walked away without another word. The hallway settled again. The technician closed the panel and stepped back. That felt different. Ethan picked up his cart. "It is." He moved on. Same pace, same routine. But behind him, the system was no longer the only thing keeping the building safe. This time, someone else had seen it early enough to act. By the end of the month, nothing about the building looked different from the outside, but the way it ran had changed in ways no report could fully capture. The system still displayed green. The dashboard still showed stability. But now, every overnight cycle carried a second layer of attention. Not loud, not formal, just present. At 2:12 a.m., Ethan walked past the panel as he always did, but this time he did not stop. He glanced once, just long enough to confirm what he already expected. Balanced, predictable, no hidden rise, no delayed drop. Behind him, the junior technician stood at the auxiliary panel, checking distribution without being asked. He did not call Ethan over. He did not need confirmation. He knew what normal looked like now. Across the room, a new engineer reviewed the logs from earlier shifts. Not just the alerts, the quiet sections too. The parts that used to be ignored because nothing had gone wrong. Laura Whitman entered a few minutes later. She did not take over the room. She did not speak immediately. She looked at the panel, then at the technician, then at the log screen. Anything? No anomalies, the technician said. Clear. Direct. Laura nodded. Keep logging the low-load cycles. It was not a correction anymore. It was routine. Ethan moved down the corridor, finishing the last of his rounds. The work had not changed. Surfaces still needed to be cleaned. Trash still needed to be taken out. The building still depended on the same quiet tasks no one noticed. He reached the end of the hallway and stopped for a moment. Not because something was wrong, but because everything was exactly where it should be. He pulled out his notebook. The pages were filled now. Dates, times, patterns, adjustments, and long stretches where nothing happened. He turned to a new page, wrote the time, wrote the load, then added one more line. Observed. No action required. He closed the notebook and held it for a second before slipping it back into his pocket. Behind him, the panel remained steady. No alarms. No warnings. No need for intervention. And that was the result that mattered. Not the correction. Not the recognition. The absence of a problem that could have been missed. As Ethan stepped toward the exit, the lights overhead stayed constant. The systems held their balance, and the building continued into the night without interruption. Inside the panel room, the technician made one final entry into the system log. Manual observation completed. No imbalance detected. A simple line. Easy to overlook. But it was there because someone had once noticed something small before it became something larger. Ethan pushed the door open and stepped outside into the early morning air. He did not look back. He did not need to. The system was running correctly. And now it had people who knew how to see when it was not.